Tonight, we drift back to a time when tropical breezes carried more than just the scent of mango and the occasional mosquito. They carried orders gold and sometimes secret letters soaked in the sweat of ambition. You're in Brazil well before samba soccer or carnival, though there is definitely a kind of performance happening all around. It's the early 1700s and Portugal, a little country with big dreams, is squeezing this lush colony like a lemon into its royal tea. You are surrounded by fields of sugarcane, their blades whispering under the sun, and by mountain veins glinting with gold pulsing like arteries that feed an empire across the sea. Everyone's working hard, some because they have no choice, others because they believe God and crown demand it, and somewhere in that mix, resentment bubbles. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, why not post your location and what time it is where you are? Let's see how far across the map tonight's journey reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge alongside a mule caravan dragging sacks of gold ore across Brazil's dusty trails, whispering complaints at the Portuguese officials who weigh every ounce with a greed-polished scale. The colony has become an extractor's paradise. Portugal isn't just collecting sugar and coffee, it's guzzling gold, especially from the Minas Gerais region, where the air always smells a little like dynamite and anxiety. In Lisbon, the monarchy grows fat on this wealth, refurbishing palaces while investing embarrassingly little in the land that produces their riches. Brazil builds the fortune, Portugal buys the mirrors. But the colony isn't just a field of commodities, it's becoming home to Creoles, merchants, priests and thinkers who start asking the inconvenient questions. Why is Brazil a colony and not a kingdom? Why must its riches go elsewhere while roads remain potholes and education feels like a rumor? The locals start murmuring. In taverns over stale bread and homemade cachaça, someone brings up the word inconfidencia, conspiracy. The most famous one, Inconfidencia Mineira in 1789, bubbles up from the gold-rich heartland. A dentist turned revolutionary, yes, a dentist named Tiradentes becomes the poster child of rebellion. His plan, overthrow Portuguese control and make Brazil its own republic. His mistake, not having a very discreet inner circle. The conspiracy leaks, the crown gets spooked and Tiradentes is hanged, drawn and quartered. His head is stuck on a pike in the square as a public mood killer. Historians still argue whether Tiradentes truly had a viable plan or was more symbol than strategist, but his execution plants a seed. Freedom might cost blood, but it also smells suspiciously like roasted meat and liberty. Meanwhile, Portugal tightens the leash. They raise taxes such as the dirham, a brutal levy that demands gold whether it's been mined or not. People begin hiding their nuggets under floorboards or in hollowed-out Bibles. You don't trust anyone, not even the priest. Yet in spite of this tension, or maybe because of it, Brazil keeps growing. New towns emerge, churches rise with dizzyingly intricate gold interiors crafted ironically from the same ore exported to Europe, and slavery becomes the backbone of the economy. Millions of Africans are forcibly brought to Brazilian soil, a shadow behind every sugarcane stalk and beneath every Baroque ceiling. It's a wound that shapes the land, its music, and its future. You ride past these contradictions on horseback, seeing opulence and oppression sharing the same dusty roads. The aristocrats throw balls with imported wigs while enslaved workers carry trays of food they'll never taste. It's a strange stage, and soon a major player will enter it, floating quite literally across the Atlantic. Because while Brazil grits its teeth under colonial pressure, Napoleon Bonaparte is stomping across Europe, making monarchs sweat and hide their jewels. And one particular monarch, Portugal's Prince Regent João, will make a decision that's part absurd, part brilliant, and completely unprecedented in colonial history. But for now, you settle into the sticky warmth of a Brazilian evening, watching lanterns flicker in villages that hum with murmurs of change. The empire seems distant, yet the strings it pulls are right here, wrapped around your arms like sugarcane vines. You wake up to the sound of waves and confusion. Cannons are being loaded not for war but for ceremony. Portugal's royal court is packing its bags, its furniture, and roughly 15,000 pieces of fine porcelain onto ships bound for Brazil. Yes, Brazil. While most European royals dig trenches or flee to countryside manors, when Napoleon approaches Prince Regent João of Portugal, does something gloriously impractical. He moves his entire court across the ocean. It's 1807, and with French troops marching toward Lisbon, João decides that if the empire is in danger, the empire will simply sail away. You watch the spectacle from the docks. Courtiers in powdered wigs slip on wet gangplanks, trunks of opera costumes jostle for space with barrels of salted cod, and someone's trying to bring a harpsichord on a boat that's already listing to one side. Even João's mentally ill mother, Queen Maria Mai, boards with regal confusion. The royal family sets sail under British protection, because Britain, as usual, has its fingers in everyone's business, especially if those fingers can grab a port or two. The voyage is long, damp, and seasickness becomes a sort of background music. But eventually the ships arrive in Rio de Janeiro, and Brazil's sleepy colonial capital is about to get a makeover it didn't ask for. Overnight, it becomes the seat of the Portuguese Empire, and suddenly your neighbor is the Prince Regent. The dusty streets of Rio fill with bureaucrats, nobles, military officers, artists, and for some reason, a small army of personal chefs. You wander the transformed city where old slave markets now neighbor libraries, and streets once filled with stray dogs now echo with French opera arias. João opens the colony's ports to friendly nations, which mostly means Britain, of course, creating a boom in trade and a flood of British goods accents and debts. The colony's economy diversifies almost overnight. Rio, once provincial, now wears the scent of empire like new cologne, overwhelming and slightly misplaced. Historians still argue whether João intended to create a permanent court or just didn't want to go back home, but the result is the same. Brazil is no longer a passive colony. It is effectively the capital of the Portuguese world. The court sets up royal printing presses, schools of science and arts, botanical gardens, and a national bank. All of this in a city that just weeks earlier was mostly trading sugar and sunstroke. But of course, the glamour is uneven. While aristocrats drink tea imported from Macau in salons decorated with azulejo tiles enslaved, Africans continue to toil in sugar fields and city households. Over half the population remains in chains carrying pianos up hills, while ministers debate Enlightenment ideals over imported brandy, and João awkward, indecisive but surprisingly practical rules from the tropics. He attends mass, obsessively kisses holy relics like their snacks and sweats through formal coats that were clearly designed for northern winters. Yet he adapts. He learns to enjoy tropical fruit, though he never fully trusts the parrots. In a delightful little irony, the Portuguese crown builds more infrastructure in Rio in a decade than they had in the previous 2 centuries of colonial rule. You walk past buildings still under construction plaster, drying in the sticky air, courtiers arguing about window shapes while locals simply try to get to work. Then news comes in 1815. Brazil is no longer a colony at all, at least on paper. João declares it a co-equal part of the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves, a grand name for a somewhat awkward arrangement. The move is meant to cement a legitimacy, especially with Europe watching. But on the streets it feels more like lipstick on a coconut. The real shift is psychological. Brazilians begin to think of themselves not just as subjects, but as citizens of a kingdom. Still, João's days in paradise are numbered. When Napoleon falls, European monarchies, ever obsessed with decorum and order, start murmuring time to come home. Pressure mounts for João to return to Lisbon and restore normalcy. Even the Portuguese elites grumble what is a court without a homeland. And so in 1821, after 14 years of tropical reign, João boards another ship. But he doesn't leave Brazil empty-handed or empty-hearted. Before departing, he plants a curious seed. He leaves his son Dom Pedro behind as Prince Regent of Brazil, just in case, like a bookmark in history. You watch the ships fade into the Atlantic mist, João waving a handkerchief that may or may not be damp from tears or just tropical humidity. The city seems quieter, unsure of itself, but the stage is now set. Brazil is no longer just a land of export. It's tasted power, and it liked the flavor. You stretch in the humid air as Rio settles into its post-royal routine, except the royals haven't really left. Dom Pedro Juan's son remains behind, not quite a king, not yet a rebel, lounging in palaces that still smell faintly of British wax and tropical mildew. He rides through the city in tailored coats, far too hot for the climate, waving at Brazilians who aren't entirely sure whether to cheer bow or just keep walking. It's a strange moment in history where you sip sugarcane juice in a plaza that might double as the backdrop for a revolution or a royal wedding, depending on how the week unfolds. Dom Pedro is young, handsome by 19th century standards, and famously fond of horses, music, and women. He plays piano, writes political manifestos with flowery penmanship, and throws lavish parties where guests dance barefoot on marble floors, slick with condensation. He's also impulsive, a man whose idea of diplomacy includes sword duels and deeply emotional public speeches. You catch a glimpse of him at one such soiree, his cravat slightly askew, passionately arguing that Brazil deserves more autonomy just before launching into a waltz with a French baroness. By now, Rio de Janeiro isn't just a colonial backwater, it's the heart of an empire in transition. Theatres open with imported velvet curtains, books flow from the royal printing press like gossip from a bored dowager. The National Library receives thousands of volumes shipped from Lisbon, some useful, some purely decorative, like 300-page treatises on Portuguese cheese. Still, there's something deeper changing. Brazilians, especially the Creole elite, born in Brazil but raised on Enlightenment ideals, begin to see themselves as more than just subjects. They are landowners, merchants, thinkers, and priests who start to whisper that maybe, just maybe, they can steer their own destiny. The fact that the king once ruled from Rio, even if temporarily, has left a psychic imprint. If the empire can come here, why can't it stay here? Historians still argue whether the crown underestimated how deeply its tropical experiment altered Brazil's self-image. But in those candle-lit salons and chaotic markets, you feel it. There's a crack in the mirror of colonial identity. The colony doesn't look like a colony anymore, it looks like a nation in waiting. Meanwhile, Dom Pedro straddles a diplomatic minefield. Portugal's liberal revolution of 1820 erupts like a penknife in a corset, small, sharp, and unexpectedly painful. Lisbon's new Cortes, full of constitutional dreams and nationalistic fire, demands the prince return. They want to reassert control, rewrite laws, and basically remind Brazil it's still technically the obedient younger sibling. But Pedro delays. He cites administrative tasks, then illness, then poor travel conditions. Really, he's just in no rush to abandon a country where he's adored, rich, and able to wear feathers in his hat without being mocked by other royals. You stand near the royal stables and overhear whispers from palace guards. Some say Pedro has no intention of returning to Portugal. Others say he'll go but come back with an army. No one knows for sure, including Pedro himself. Outside the palace, Brazilians grow restless. They fear being demoted back to colonial status. Political clubs pop up like mushrooms after rain, each one brimming with fiery speeches and slightly watered-down wine. In São Paulo, in Minas, even in the remote reaches of Bahia, landowners and local politicians begin exchanging letters, carefully worded, of course, suggesting that if Pedro stays, perhaps he could lead a new, independent Brazil. There's a particular tension in the air, like the moment just before a thunderstorm. You hear it in the horse hooves on cobblestones, in the pause before someone says independence out loud. Everyone knows the word is coming, but no one wants to be the first to shout it. And amid all of this, Dom Pedro continues to act. Confusingly. One day, he bans Portuguese troops from entering Rio without permission. The next day, he plays flute duets with a visiting general. You can't help but wonder if he's buying time or if he simply enjoys dramatic tension. One quirky detail, Pedro reportedly had a pet monkey that once caused a minor diplomatic incident by stealing important documents off a minister's desk. The monkey wasn't punished, the minister was. Classic. At this point, Brazil stands at the edge of something irreversible. Portugal wants its prince back. Brazil wants its prince to become something more. And Pedro, lounging in silk shirts beside Brazilian waterfalls, will soon be forced to choose between obeying his homeland or becoming the symbol of a new one. You ride alongside Dom Pedro as the morning sun flickers through the trees lining the road to São Cristóvão. His horse kicks up little bursts of red dust, and his silk jacket is already damp with sweat, but his jaw is set tighter than usual. You feel it too, something has shifted. The man who once seemed like a charming placeholder is now looking suspiciously like a national leader in the making. And it's not just the outfit today, though. He did notably ditch the European brocade for a more modest military coat trimmed with Brazilian green. Back in Lisbon, the Cortes have grown increasingly agitated. They're sending a cascade of official letters, orders, demands, basically yelling across the Atlantic in bureaucratic Portuguese. They want Pedro to come home immediately and disband the Brazilian administrative bodies, which had been quite politely trying to keep things running in his father's absence. The message is clear, the fun is over. Brazil is a colony again, and any dreams of autonomy can kindly take a long walk off a short pier. The Brazilian elite, however, isn't having it. Merchants, judges and landowners start sending their own letters, open ones, passionate ones, sometimes with suspiciously poetic flourishes. Their message is just as clear: stay, please Pedro, stay. The most famous of these letters comes from the Senado da Câmara of São Paulo and reads like a clingy yet noble love letter. And this is where you witness a moment so central it will later be taught in every Brazilian classroom, though usually without all the humidity and awkward tension. On January 9, 1822, Dom Pedro makes his choice. Surrounded by his advisors, scribes, and maybe a dog or two, he looks up from a letter and declares, with just enough flair to guarantee historical immortality: "Se é para o bem de todos e felicidade geral da nação, diga ao povo que fico." If it is for the good of all and the happiness of the nation, tell the people I am staying. That single word, Fico, I stay, is his quiet rebellion, his soft revolution, his polite way of telling Portugal to go find someone else to boss around. Historians still argue whether Pedro's decision was driven more by personal ego-political pressure or a genuine belief in Brazilian self-determination. He was no Enlightenment philosopher, but he understood theatre, and Fico was a blockbuster performance. Word spreads like wildfire. Crowds cheer, cannons are fired in celebration, and someone composes a march within a week. You walk the streets of Rio hearing shopkeepers humming the tune and children pretending to be Pedro on stick horses shouting Fico at pigeons. It's the sound of a colony beginning to believe in itself. But, of course, Portugal doesn't clap politely and move on. Instead, they double down. The Cortes annul Pedro's powers, issue new decrees to undermine Brazilian institutions, and send more troops to strategic ports like Bahia and Pernambuco. It's becoming obvious that this won't be settled with words and wine. Dom Pedro, now essentially acting as a rebel prince, begins traveling across provinces, forging alliances with key governors and military commanders. He leans into the image of a tropical liberator, even if he still writes home, asking his father to mediate with the Cortes. You get the sense he wants to break free, he's just trying to do it without breaking the furniture. And yet, he's more committed than ever. His wife, Maria Leopoldina of Austria, yes, he married a Habsburg, proves to be an unexpectedly fierce political partner. In letters and meetings, she urges him to stop begging for Lisbon's approval and start acting like the leader of a sovereign nation. She's practical, sharp, and arguably more ideologically firm than Pedro himself. Plus, she writes in 6 languages and manages to be diplomatic while pregnant, which is frankly heroic. The tension escalates. You witness skirmishes in ports, pamphlets fluttering from balconies, and more of Pedro's symbolic gestures, banning Portuguese troops from certain provinces, promoting Brazilian-born officials, and declaring Brazil's laws no longer subordinate to Lisbon's edicts. These moves aren't just administrative, they're declarations in disguise. Meanwhile, the people, at least the land-owning Portuguese-speaking elite, rally. But beneath them, enslaved Africans, indigenous Brazilians, and poor labourers are mostly watching from the sidelines, their fates once again decided by those on horseback. Independence might be approaching, but for many, liberation is still a distant hope. Still you feel it. The language is changing. People say nation instead of colony, Brazilian instead of Portuguese in Brazil. The psychological shift is already done. The political one is just catching up. By now, Pedro is visibly restless. You see him pacing verandas, scrawling manifestos by lantern light, stopping mid-sentence to adjust his sword belt. He knows what's coming. He's just not sure when to say it out loud. But that moment is close, very close, because once you say Fico history expects a sequel. You're standing on the veranda of a colonial mansion in São Paulo, and the air is thick with anticipation and wood smoke. The horses are saddled. The prince's attendants scurry with bundles of scrolls and spare uniforms. Inside, Dom Pedro paces again, his boots tapping a staccato rhythm across the tiles. His wife Leopoldina sits calmly nearby, pen in hand, parchment before her. You watch as she drafts the letter that will later be called the political birth certificate of a nation. It's September circa 1822. She writes to her husband, who is preparing to ride. The fruit is ripe. It is time to cut the cord. 5 days later, Pedro gallops along the banks of the Ipiranga River just outside São Paulo. He's flanked by soldiers' aides and a few startled cows. The road is dusty, the sun relentless, and his face flushed with travel and adrenaline. Suddenly a messenger catches up, handing him letters from Lisbon. More demands, more decrees, more attempts to strip him of power and reduce Brazil back to a mere colony. That's it. Pedro halts. His horse whinnies and stamps the dirt. He scans the letters, eyes narrowing, mouth tightening. Then he tears them up, unsheathes his sword, and raises it to the sky. The moment has been retold so many times it feels half myth, but you're there watching him shout the words that will echo in every Brazilian textbook for centuries: Independencia or morte, independence or death. And just like that, the prince becomes a liberator. The banner of Portugal doesn't fall from the trees, and the clouds don't part into heavenly rays. But in that moment, under that blazing sky, Brazil's break from Portugal becomes more than just paperwork, it becomes personal. Historians still argue whether the scene was as dramatic as legend claims. Some say Pedro didn't even raise his sword. Others claim he was sick with diarrhea and had to stop riding shortly after. But in the national imagination, the Ipiranga cry is sacred. You can practically hear the background music swelling, even if the cows remained unimpressed. Pedro and his entourage return to São Paulo in triumph. Crowds line the roads, waving palm fronds and handmade flags. Musicians play what they hope sounds like national anthems, though one band accidentally performs a slow polka. The prince is now Dom Pedro the Firmer, and Brazil is officially claiming independence, not just in words, but in posture, in paperwork, and soon in war. Because, of course, Portugal doesn't just shrug and say, fair enough. Tensions escalate. Military confrontations break out in the northern provinces, particularly in Bahia and Maranhão, where Portuguese loyalists and troops resist Brazilian control. It's not a single war, it's dozens of skirmishes, sieges, naval clashes, and political reckonings. You find yourself ducking into stone churches as gunshots echo in the streets. In Bahia, Afro-Brazilian fighters, indigenous groups, and local militia units take up arms for the cause, not necessarily out of love for Pedro, but out of a desire to shake loose the old empire's grip. Women smuggle gunpowder in baskets, and teenagers pose as messengers to dodge checkpoints. This isn't just a noble rebellion led by horsemen in polished boots. It's messy, loud, and full of everyday people doing unrecorded acts of bravery. Meanwhile, Dom Pedro, now back in Rio, is crowned Emperor of Brazil on December 1st, 1822. You attend the ceremony in the opulent imperial chapel. The incense is choking, the robes are too heavy, and the symbolism is complicated. He's crowned with a golden circlet that looks suspiciously European for a man claiming to lead a new world nation. But the crowds cheer, and Pedro smiles a little nervously perhaps. The empire is now real, at least on paper. It stretches over millions of square kilometers from the jungle-choked Amazon to the chilly southern pampas. And unlike most Latin American revolutions, this one created a monarchy instead of a republic. A prince turned emperor, a colony turned kingdom then country, a breakaway that chose continuity in a brand new costume. Yet beneath the pageantry, Brazil's challenges simmer. The war for recognition and control isn't over. The economy is deeply dependent on slavery, and the question of who truly benefits from independence hangs in the air like the smell of gunpowder after a celebration. Still, on that first day of December, the people cheer. The empire is young, awkward, and far from perfect, but it's theirs now. You walk the flickering, lantern-lit streets of Rio that evening, watching fireworks crackle over the bay. The ships in the harbour raise Brazilian flags stitched in haste, and somewhere in the city's back alleys and dusty courtyards, someone dares to whisper, "We did it." You wake the next morning in a city still ringing with the echoes of fireworks, only to find the empire sobering up fast. The bunting is still hanging, but the mood is different now, less celebration, more calculation. Dom Pedro may be emperor, but Brazil is a newborn wearing a crown that doesn't quite fit. And as you wander the bustling markets and overhear whispered debates in cafes where old royalists and young idealists argue over cassava bread, one thing becomes clear: declaring independence was the easy part. Now comes the hangover. Across the sprawling country, loyalties remain tangled. The north, particularly in provinces like Pará and Maranhão, still has strong Portuguese garrisons unwilling to yield. Bahia is caught in a long, grueling siege. These regions didn't attend Pedro's coronation. They're busy holding out behind stone walls and colonial forts. The battles continue, brutal and prolonged, and the cost of war, both in coin and in lives, begins to pile up like cannonballs beside the docks. Pedro, now emperor. Pedro I quickly realizes that grandeur doesn't pay the bills. He needs international recognition fast. Britain, ever the practical empire, recognizes Brazilian independence for a fee. Brazil agrees to pay £2 million to Portugal as a kind of parting gift, or, as some Brazilians mutter bitterly, a glorified breakup fee. Where does the money come from? A loan from Britain, of course, at generous interest rates. You sigh. History, it seems, always keeps receipts. And yet independence becomes official legally, diplomatically, by mid-1825. Portugal accepts the inevitable, albeit reluctantly, and Brazil's position among nations is sealed. The last Portuguese soldiers ship out, sometimes to cheers, sometimes under cover of darkness. In cities like Salvador, people erupt in joy. In others, the mood is quieter, more survival than celebration. Historians still argue whether Brazil's independence was truly a revolution or more of a peaceful divorce with a few screaming matches. After all, the leadership didn't change dramatically, and slavery, the backbone of Brazil's economy, remained untouched. For millions of Afro-Brazilians, the empire was a new banner, flying over the same old chains. Still, the sense of ownership of something finally Brazilian begins to take root. Newspapers flourish, artists and poets craft patriotic odes. You stroll by street performers singing songs about Ipiranga and Fico, while children wave miniature flags made of painted cloth. Even coins begin to bear Pedro's face, which he reportedly enjoyed a little too much. But the crown weighs heavier than he expected. The empire is huge, and the cracks are showing. The army is stretched thin. The provinces bicker over autonomy. Indigenous communities continue to be pushed, ignored, or violently assimilated. And behind it all, the treasury is bleeding silver. To make matters worse, Pedro's personality, so charming on horseback, is less endearing in court. He's prone to outbursts, unpredictable decisions, and a fondness for extramarital affairs that become tabloid fodder. You hear whispers about his favorite mistress, Domitila de Castro, who's eventually titled the Marchioness of Santos and granted her own palace. The affair becomes a national soap opera, with some admiring Pedro's passion, others shaking their heads at the emperor's disregard for propriety. And then there's the press. Brazil's newly minted newspapers waste no time becoming gloriously disrespectful. They print political cartoons of Pedro as a bloated rooster, publish biting editorials, and accuse ministers of everything from incompetence to witchcraft. It's messy democratic chaos, and a sign that freedom, at least on paper, is catching on. One quirky detail: Pedro composed Brazil's first national anthem himself. A decent pianist, he wrote it in a fit of enthusiasm, though critics noted that the lyrics were a bit too focused on his own glory. Imagine if your emperor handed you a mixtape and said, "This is the sound of freedom. It's very Pedro. In the provinces things are harder. Local leaders vie for power, peasant rebellions flare. Indigenous resistance continues in the Amazon." The concept of a single unified Brazil is still mostly an idea, like a half-finished mural. You walk through towns where people speak different dialects, follow different customs, and haven't seen a royal decree in years. For many, Pedro's empire is a rumor, either distant hope or distant threat. But you also see progress. Schools open, trade routes expand. A Brazilian diplomatic corps begins to form, full of bright-eyed officials in itchy uniforms trying to represent a nation that's still figuring out what it wants to be. Slowly, the framework of governance courts ministries codes starts to take shape. Imperfect, incomplete, but undeniably theirs. Pedro watches it all with tired eyes. He rides less, writes more. His speeches grow longer, more defensive. You see it in his posture, in the way he sighs before meetings. The crown may have been forged in fire, but now it's a daily burden of spreadsheets and squabbling senators. Still, he wears it, for now. You find yourself in the imperial palace once more, only now the golden chandeliers seem dimmer and the echoes in the marble halls less majestic, more hollow. Dom Pedro. I still rules, but the empire is starting to feel like a very large, very complicated animal. He's not quite sure how to ride anymore. He came in on a wave of popular support shouting, "Independence or death," but now, 5 years into his reign, the cheers are thinning out. The novelty of a native emperor has worn off. People want more than drama, they want results. And they're not getting them fast enough. Pedro's efforts to centralize power anger regional leaders who thought independence meant they would have more say. In the northeast, especially, resentment simmers. Provinces like Pernambuco, which had their own revolutionary traditions, even before Pedro shouted anything near a river, start making noise again. Some want federalism, others want a republic. A few just want to be left alone with their sugar profits. Either way, their message is clear: an emperor in Rio doesn't speak for everyone. Meanwhile, the economy limps along, war debts linger, and the British loans need to be repaid. Trade slows, inflation bites. You stroll through a once prosperous square in Bahia and notice merchants closing early, prices doubling, and the mood dipping like a tired hammock. The empire's promise that Brazil would prosper under its own flag is starting to feel like another pamphlet slogan. To make matters worse, Pedro is increasingly distracted by affairs far from Brazil. His father, João VI of Portugal, dies in 1826, and suddenly Pedro is heir to the Portuguese throne. Yes, the same throne he'd metaphorically shoved off a cliff not long ago. He becomes King Pedro IV of Portugal, while still being Emperor Pedro I of Brazil. You blink. So does most of the population. It's a bizarre double monarchy, one that lasts just long enough to confuse everyone and spark a European succession crisis. Pedro abdicates the Portuguese crown in favor of his daughter Maria II, who's still a child, so he appoints his brother Miguel as regent. You probably won't survive the family dinners after this, because within a year, Miguel usurps the throne, declares himself king, and sends Portugal into civil war. Pedro, already overwhelmed at home, is suddenly thrust back into European dynastic drama, like it's a telenovela with too many plot twists. Historians still argue whether Pedro's heart remained in Brazil or was always partly chained to Lisbon. Either way, his attention starts slipping. While Brazil deals with constitutional debates, land disputes, and social unrest, Pedro spends more time writing European emissaries and planning how to win back the Portuguese throne for his daughter. And Brazil notices. Opposition grows. Newspapers become ferocious, calling him a foreign puppet, a tyrant, or worse, ineffective. Intellectuals who once supported him begin shifting toward republican ideals. Even his military commanders grow impatient. The famous liberal figure, Frei Caneca, monk, teacher, and revolutionary, is executed in 1825 for participating in a rebellion in Pernambuco. His death sends ripples through the nation. You overhear a street preacher mutter, "We traded kings for crowns, not for freedom," and the monarchy still rests atop slavery. Despite loud whisperings of abolitionism among intellectuals, Pedro does little to address the brutal system propping up Brazil's economy. Plantations still run on chains and whips. The empire talks of liberty, but the fields say otherwise. Then in 1829, Pedro makes one of his boldest and most controversial moves, yet he dissolves the Brazilian assembly, just shuts it down. Claims they were plotting against him. You sit in a cafe and hear the news over bitter coffee and stunned silence. People are livid. The emperor, who once stood for independence, is now seen as censoring the very voices that fought for it. Protests erupt in São Paulo, in Rio. Even among moderates, the mood shifts. Pedro becomes a symbol not of revolution, but of regression. His legitimacy begins to crumble like old plaster under rain. And yet he doesn't give up the throne, not yet. Instead, he clings to it like a man clinging to a leaky lifeboat while staring longingly at another ship halfway across the Atlantic. You see him walking the palace halls late at night, pacing, muttering, haunted. The same man who once shouted independence or death now whispers, just a little longer. But history has a schedule, and it's nearly time for Brazil's first emperor to take his final bow. You wake to the muffled sound of carriage wheels grinding against the cobbled courtyard outside São Cristóvão Palace. The sun hasn't yet crested the bay, but something has changed. Inside, Pedro is awake early for once, not for a council meeting, nor a ball, nor a duel of quills in the local press. He's writing. Not a speech, not a decree, not even another piano-accompanied national anthem. It's a letter of abdication. On April 7, 1831, Dom Pedro I steps down. Not with a flourish, not with fireworks, just a tired man folding up his legacy like an overused uniform. He writes that he's leaving the throne in favor of his 5-year-old son, Pedro II. Then he packs up his belongings, some books, portraits, a dagger given to him by a tribal leader, and probably the occasional exotic pet, and sails back to Europe to fight a civil war in Portugal. Because of course he does. You watch his ship drift out from Rio's harbour, its sails catching a steady breeze, its figurehead cutting through the foam. There are no parades. No imperial orchestra playing farewell. Just the quiet slap of waves against wood and the hush of a crowd unsure how to feel. Some jeer, some weep, others sip coffee, shrug and mutter, "Finally." Historians still argue whether Pedro's abdication was a noble gesture of paternal foresight or simply an emperor fleeing a country that no longer loved him. Either way, he leaves behind a turbulent empire and a throne occupied by a child too small to wear the crown without tripping on it. And so begins Brazil's regency period, a time as chaotic as it is formative. You ever curious? Stick around, because what follows is the world's strangest babysitting arrangement. Brazil, massive and diverse, must now be ruled in the name of a toddler. No divine right of kings, no experienced monarch, just a collection of regents, politicians, generals, aristocrats, each trying to steer the ship without capsizing it. It goes about as well as you'd expect. You travel to Bahia and witness revolts by disenfranchised military units. In Maranhão, the Balaiada uprising erupts, led in part by poor farmers and enslaved people. In Pará, the Cabanagem rebellion breaks out so severe that rebels actually take over the provincial capital for a while. Across the empire, factions jostle federalists versus centralists, monarchists versus republicans, abolitionists versus slaveholders. Brazil, it turns out, isn't one voice. It's a chorus of arguments echoing across 8.5 million square kilometers. The regents struggle to maintain cohesion. They try reform censorship, military crackdowns. You attend speeches where powdered wigs slip off mid-rant, and debate halls where someone inevitably storms out after thumping the table with a rolled-up constitution. But amid the chaos, something else begins to bloom: a national identity. Not from palace orders or royal decrees, but from the provinces themselves. Brazilians, for the first time in history, are arguing not just about the empire, but within it. And in a strange, backhanded way, the Regency teaches Brazil to think of itself not as Portuguese South America, but as Brazil, a country, a place with a personality, not just a product list. One quirky moment in the 1830s, a man named Antonio Conselheiro begins preaching in the northeast, predicting the downfall of corrupt authority and the rise of divine justice. He's dismissed as a madman, but his followers grow. Decades later, he'll inspire one of Brazil's most famous resistance movements, the War of Canudos. For now, he's just a fringe voice. But even in the margins, you feel history humming. Meanwhile, little Pedro II grows. The court dresses him in uniforms he swims inside. He learns Latin math, astronomy, and political theory, while his regents try not to lose the country. You see him on balconies waving mechanically, his feet dangling. He's just a boy. But people begin to hope. Hope for stability, for a leader not torn between two continents, for a sovereign with both roots and reason. That hope begins to solidify in 1840 when Pedro II, still only 14, is declared of age. The golpe de maioridade, or coup of majority, ends the regency early. Parliament decides Brazil needs a monarch now, not later. And so the empire rises again, this time not with a dramatic sword in the air, but with a young boy standing a bit too stiffly in front of a crowd, trying desperately to believe in him. You stand beneath the flickering gas lamps of Rio, brushing off a late evening drizzle as a teenage emperor ascends his throne. 14-year-old Pedro II is awkward pale and more interested in books than balls. But Brazilians, weary of revolts, loans, and regents who argue more than they govern, welcome him like a lighthouse in stormy waters. There's a collective exhale across the empire. A boy emperor might seem risky, but at least he's here, and unlike his father, he doesn't seem tempted to board a ship at the first sign of a constitutional crisis. Young Pedro II quickly reveals himself to be different. He studies obsessively, waking before dawn to memorize Latin declensions and Portuguese law. He keeps a microscope in his chambers and prefers astronomy lectures to diplomatic receptions. He doesn't gamble, doesn't chase scandal, and rarely raises his voice. If Dom Pedro, I was the hot-blooded liberator on horseback, Pedro II is the patient gardener, planting roots into the idea of a truly Brazilian monarch. You peer into court sessions where the young emperor listens more than he speaks. Ministers, at first skeptical, begin deferring to his judgment. By the time he's 20, he's reading budgets like novels and out-debating seasoned politicians on tax policy. His modesty becomes legend. He walks the streets without guards, speaks to commoners in unpolished Portuguese, and reportedly once scolded an aristocrat for stepping on a street urchin's toy. But Brazil remains complicated. The empire is too big for comfort. Regional revolts flare again, especially in Rio Grande do Sul, where the ragamuffin war simmers for a decade. Gauchos declare a short-lived republic wearing flamboyant sashes and moustaches you could lose a fork in. The conflict is partly about local autonomy, partly about tariffs, and mostly about the fact that Brazil's south often feels more like Uruguay's cousin than Rio's neighbor. Pedro II, ever the diplomat, uses a mix of negotiations and strategic amnesty to end the rebellion in 1845. You watch him shake hands with former rebels, smiling politely, while his advisors sweat through their jackets. It's a masterclass in patient statecraft, less thunder, more long drizzle. Historians still debate whether Pedro II was a true liberal reformer or simply a skilled administrator riding the tide of global change. But under his reign, Brazil begins to modernize. Telegraph lines stretch like metallic spiderwebs from city to city. Railroads sprout across provinces, puffing smoke into forests that had never heard a train whistle before. A national currency is stabilized, immigration is encouraged, and the coffee boom transforms São Paulo from a sleepy town to a buzzing economic engine. Of course, progress comes with caveats. Slavery remains the aching wound of the empire. By mid-century, Brazil is the largest slaveholding society in the Americas. Enslaved Africans still till fields, work in mines, and build palaces, even as railroads arrive and telegraphs buzz. Pedro II opposes slavery in principle. He calls it a national disgrace but proceeds with glacial caution. He fears civil war, economic collapse and political backlash. So he pushes abolition inch by inch. First, the international slave trade is banned. Then children born to enslaved mothers are declared free, though still required to work into adulthood. Finally, in 1888, 1 year after Pedro's reign ends, slavery is abolished completely. But you can't help noticing by then the empire has already begun to wobble, too. Still, for much of Pedro II's rule, Brazil enjoys a strange, graceful stability. European monarchs write him letters in admiration. American presidents send him gifts. The press, though critical, generally respects his intelligence and restraint. You stroll past bookstores with portraits of the emperor framed beside portraits of Goethe and Pasteur. He's become more than a ruler. He's a symbol of order in an often chaotic continent. One curious detail, Pedro II was a lifelong fan of photography. He even corresponded with Louis Daguerre and owned one of the first cameras in South America. Sometimes he'd photograph visiting dignitaries himself. Imagine having your passport photo taken by an emperor. Talk about pressure. But beneath the calm forces gather. Republican sentiment spreads especially among military officers who feel sidelined, coffee barons who want more control, and urban intellectuals who whisper that monarchy is a dusty leftover in a world moving toward republics. You hear these whispers in salons, in lecture halls, even in railway compartments. They don't shout, not yet, but they're waiting. Pedro, now grey-bearded and tired, senses it. He shrinks from power rather than clings to it. His daughter, Princess Isabel, who passed the Golden Law abolishing slavery, becomes the symbolic heir, but never ascends the throne. And somewhere across the streets that now bear imperial names in cities lit by gas lamps paid for by coffee exports and slave labor change is coming. Not with a declaration this time, nor a sword in the air, but with uniforms, newspapers, and the soft click of telegraph keys sending word of a republic. You rise before dawn in Rio de Janeiro one last time under the empire's long shadow. It's 1889 and something electric hangs in the humid air. Not celebration, not crisis, but the unsettling quiet of a deep breath held too long. The streetcars still rattle, the harbour still bustles, and the coffee still steams in porcelain cups. But in the barracks, in cafes, in editorials printed at dawn, a whisper has grown into something more. A republic is coming. Pedro II is now 74. His beard is snowy, his gait slower, and his eyes often cast toward books more than subjects. For years he has faded gently from governance, delegating, to ministers, and quietly refusing to name a male heir. Brazil's elites, once loyal to the empire, have begun to question its usefulness. The military feels underappreciated. Republican ideals imported via France and the United States are tossed around in debates wrapped in words like progress, liberty, and modernity. The final push comes not with bombs or blood, but paperwork. On November 15, 1889, Marshal Deodoro da Fonseca, sick, reluctant, and asthmatic, leads a military coup, so bloodless you almost miss it. Soldiers march through the city. Politicians are escorted, not arrested. The monarchy, it turns out, doesn't fall so much as it steps politely aside. Pedro II, woken with the news, simply blinks. He reads the proclamation of the Republic, folds it and nods. There's no grand speech, no fiery condemnation, just a weary emperor who sees the arc of history bending and chooses not to resist. He reportedly says, "If that is so, it will be my retirement. I shall return to Europe and dedicate myself to science and literature." Historians still argue whether the monarchy could have survived with reforms or if it was doomed by its own decorum. But in truth, Pedro had lost the will to reign. His beloved daughter, Isabel, had no political base. The elite feared her progressive ideals. And Pedro, in his quiet humility, refused to risk civil strife for a dynasty he no longer believed in. You stand silently in the port of Rio watching as the imperial family boards a ship to Lisbon. No cheering crowd, no farewell parade. Just a few tearful servants and an aging monarch clutching a leather case full of letters, photographs, and perhaps one of his old microscopes. The Republic is declared, the crown quite literally is boxed up and stored in the National Museum. In exile, Pedro II lives modestly in Paris. He attends scientific lectures, visits opera houses, and reads endlessly. He dies in 1891 with just a few close friends around him. His last words: "May God grant me these last wishes, peace and prosperity for Brazil." And so Brazil's imperial chapter closes. It began with a prince's declaration beside a river, swelled into the reign of a bookish emperor, and ended with a gentle abdication. No guillotines, no civil war, just a quiet fading into republican dawn. Yet you feel the empire's traces everywhere, in the architecture of old capitals, in railway lines that follow imperial visions, in debates that still echo about monarchy identity and the long, slow journey from colony to nation. And in the flag, not the imperial green and gold of Pedro's crown, but its echoes preserved in Brazil's current banner. The motto, Ordem e Progresso, order and progress, drawn from positivist ideals that first took root during the empire's last years. One quirky final footnote: in 1920, Brazil's government officially repatriates Pedro II's remains. His coffin arrives to flowers, parades, even tears. The Republic, firmly in place by then, salutes the emperor it once overthrew. Tonight, in the warm quiet of your room, you trace the long arc from colony to crown to country. Brazil's independence wasn't a single shout or a single battle. It was a series of choices, arguments, contradictions, and people flawed, fascinating, and always dreaming. And now, gently. The sails are down now. The parades have long since faded. The courtyards are quiet. You walk through a palace hallway where dust gathers in sunbeams and the golden frame of a forgotten portrait tilts ever so slightly on the wall. The empire that once spanned jungles and coastlines, coffee plantations and marble salons has gone to sleep. You pass old streets still bearing royal names where trees lean over iron gates and the scent of orange blossoms lingers in the air. The voices of the past murmur gently, some triumphant, some wistful, all fading into silence. No more proclamations, no more parades, just the soft breath of time moving forward. Pedro's pen rests beside his books. The crown lies beneath glass in a museum no longer worn, but still glinting softly in memory. The country moves on, shaped not only by those who ruled it, but by those who lived, resisted, and hoped within it. And you, drifting now, carry the echo of it all. The gold mines, the sugar fields, the whispered conspiracies, the declarations shouted beside rivers, the treaties signed by candlelight, the letters written in sorrow and resolve. It all settles like mist around you.
Let it. Let the empire drift.
Breathe in, let it go. The crown has been set down. The nation sleeps, sweet dreams.